Hello and welcome. Tonight we'll journey back in time for a boringly fascinating look at some of the gross realities of ancient hygiene, the kind of everyday details of history that are often overlooked. Don't worry though, our tone will remain calm, gentle, and soothing. This is boring history for sleep. After all, you can simply listen, relax, and even drift off as I drone on about the dirty little secrets of the past. There will be no loud noises or sudden surprises, just a steady, monotonous exploration of how people kept clean or didn't in long-ago civilizations. It might be a bit humorous at times, because let's face it, some of these old practices were very odd or unpleasant, but everything will be delivered in a soft, measured voice. Picture an old librarian reading you mildly gross facts as a bedtime story. You may hear about unappealing ancient bathroom habits, peculiar remedies, and the strange ways our ancestors dealt with dirt and odors. As odd as these topics are, they'll be described in a matter-of-fact, almost lulling way, so you can feel free to close your eyes and let your mind wander. Our historical tour will touch on several cultures, from the meticulous cleanliness rituals of ancient Egypt with a few rather icky twists, to the communal bathrooms of ancient Rome, to the resourceful yet sometimes revolting practices in ancient China. We'll wander through the filth of medieval Europe and even peek at other parts of the world, like how the Indus Valley managed their sewage, or what hygiene looked like for the Aztecs and others. Each section will flow gently into the next, with smooth segues guiding you farther along in time and space. Remember, you don't need to actively follow along if you're feeling sleepy. It's perfectly fine to let your mind drift. I'll keep talking in a low, steady manner. The content might be a bit gross if you think too hard about it, but I'll keep the descriptions mild and oddly comforting in their mundanity. By hearing how messy life was in the past, perhaps you'll appreciate the coziness of your clean bed even more. So fluff up your pillow, snuggle in, and allow this oddly soothing journey through the dirt and grime of history to carry you towards sleep. Let's begin our tour, nice and slowly, with one of the earliest civilizations known for both its elegance and its obsession with cleanliness, and some surprising dirty secrets in ancient Egypt. Ancient Egypt. Rituals of cleanliness and unexpected nastiness. We start in ancient Egypt, a land of pharaohs, golden temples, and daily sanitation rituals. The Egyptians were actually quite concerned with cleanliness. In fact, by ancient standards, they were almost clean freaks. Many bathed frequently in the Nile or in tubs, and wealthier Egyptians even had bathrooms in their homes. Priests would wash multiple times a day as part of religious purity. Cleanliness was partly spiritual to them, an offering to the gods, and partly practical, given the hot climate and abundant bugs along the Nile. Bathing and personal grooming were important daily tasks. Without soap as we know it, Egyptians cleansed their skin with a type of clay or with natron, a natural soda ash, mixed with water. They often scented themselves with oils or perfumes after washing. Imagine a nobleman or noblewoman having a servant pour cool water over them in a courtyard, then rubbing their skin with fragrant oils of lotus or jasmine. It sounds luxurious, and it was, but it was also their way of combating body odor and the harsh desert conditions. To stay fresh, the upper classes might even wear little cones of perfumed fat on top of their wigs. As the day went on, the cone would slowly melt, releasing a pleasant fragrance over their hair and clothes. Unconventional, yes, but apparently effective at masking unpleasant smells. Hair care in ancient Egypt was also dictated by the climate and by pests. Lice were a constant nuisance in the ancient world. The Egyptians came up with a drastic solution. Most wealthy Egyptians shaved their heads completely. Men, women, everyone who could afford it often went totally bald, and many also kept their bodies free of hair. This wasn't a fashion statement so much as a hygiene measure. By removing their natural hair, they removed the cozy home that lice and fleas loved to inhabit. Instead, they wore elaborate wigs when they wanted the appearance of hair. These wigs, made from human hair or sometimes horsehair, could be taken off and cleaned separately, or even thrown out when too infested, which was much easier than delosing one's real hair. Picture an elegant Egyptian lady reclining at dinner, her head crowned with a thick black wig braided with gold threads. What you don't see is that underneath that fashionable wig, her scalp is smooth and shaved. It was a practical kind of beauty. Of course, even wigs could get lice, but they could be boiled or picked over without the wearer having to suffer bites on their actual scalp. In Egyptian tomb paintings, you'll often see servants grooming wealthy people, likely picking insects out of wigs or scrubbing their bare heads with scented ointments. It was an everyday battle to stay clean in a buggy environment. The emphasis on cleanliness even extended to dental care, though their methods might make us cringe. Ancient Egyptians noticed early on that eating sugary dates and bread full of coarse grit from their stone-ground flour caused teeth to decay or wear down. They developed one of the world's first toothpastes, or tooth powders really. However, the ingredients were, let's say, less than minty fresh. A typical Egyptian tooth cleaning powder could include things like burnt eggshells and pulverized ox hooves, mixed with a bit of ash and perhaps a touch of myrrh for scent. This gritty powder was rubbed on the teeth with a finger or a small twig to scour away plaque. Effective, possibly, to a degree. Pleasant, probably not. One imagines their toothpaste tasting like a charcoal barbecue. But it was an attempt at maintaining oral hygiene. There's even evidence they used a form of toothbrush, basically a frayed stick, to apply these powders. So while they didn't have fluoride or floss, they certainly tried to keep their smile bright, or at least avoid unbearable toothaches. Despite these admirable habits, ancient Egyptian hygiene had a significantly gross side as well. Things rarely mentioned in shiny museum displays about pharaohs. For example, let's talk about bathrooms. In an upper-class Egyptian home, you might find a limestone toilet seat perched over a pottery bowl or pit. They did have toilets of a sort. The design was simple, a slab or wooden seat with a hole, under which a container of sand was placed. After doing one's business, the person would cover the waste with sand, much like a cat in a litter box today. Every so often, servants would empty and clean the toilet area, disposing of the waste in a pit or the river. It was basic and certainly not odor-free, but it was an improvement over just going on the ground. Poorer Egyptians probably just squatted outside or used clay pots that they emptied each morning. There was no flushing water system in Egyptian towns. Sewage mostly ended up in cesspits or the river. We can imagine that along the Nile's quieter banks, out of the way, people would relieve themselves and the evidence would wash away with the current. Not exactly sparkling sanitation, but the Nile did serve as a giant natural sewer for villages. For wiping themselves, Egyptians might use whatever was handy. Smooth stones, shards of broken pottery, sound painful, but that was a common option in the ancient world, or bunches of leaves or grass. Water for rinsing was also used when available, since water was so central to their idea of cleanliness. Pottery excavated from ancient Egyptian sites includes what some archaeologists think were personal hygiene vessels, possibly used for pouring water to wash after toilet use. If you were wealthy, you may have even had a servant whose job was to attend you in the bathroom with water and towels. In fact, some records suggest there were specialized servants or medics in the pharaoh's court for attending to the royal posterior. Yes, the pharaoh of Egypt, living god on earth, apparently had someone with the official title, guardian of the anus. This was essentially a court doctor specializing in enemas and digestive health for the king. As absurd as it sounds, the title appears in Egyptian medical papyri. The so-called shepherd of the royal anus would have been responsible for administering enemas to the pharaoh to keep him, shall we say, regular and healthy. Enemas were a common Egyptian treatment for stomach ills. They would use a tube and pump water or herbal infusions into the rectum to flush the bowels. Many Egyptians believed in periodically cleaning out the digestive system. So somewhere in the palaces of Akhenaten or Ramses, there was likely a person whose daily duty involved mixing warm water or oil and carefully giving the king an enema, a messy job, but one apparently held in high regard at the time. It's a reminder that even the most exalted individuals had very down-to-earth bodily concerns. Egyptians also had some pretty gross medical and cosmetic practices by modern standards. Their focus on hygiene didn't mean they understood germ theory or truly sterile techniques. For instance, to treat wounds, Egyptian healers sometimes applied pastes made with honey, which is fine. It can help kill bacteria, mixed with animal fat or even dried animal dung. Yes, putting dung on wounds, that was a thing. The idea might have been that the magic or medicinal properties in animal excrement could help healing. In reality, while the honey in the mixture could prevent infection, the dung was full of bacteria and likely caused infections more often than cured them. We have records in papyri of prescriptions that include crocodile dung or other fecal matter as ingredients. This sounds horrific, but the Egyptians were working with the best science they had, which often mixed religion, superstition, and observation. If a wound seemed to heal after a certain poultice was applied, they reused that recipe. Only much later would people realize that dung in a wound is not a great idea. Still, this was part of their hygiene and health toolkit. On the topic of crocodile dung, the Egyptians, and possibly their neighbors in the ancient Near East, win the prize for one of the most bizarre and gross hygiene-related practices: contraceptive pessaries made of crocodile excrement. This is one of those historical facts that sounds like a dirty joke, but it's recorded in texts. To prevent pregnancy, Egyptian women would mix crocodile dung with a bit of honey or sour milk to form a kind of paste or glob, and insert it vaginally, like a suppository before intercourse. The thought behind it might have been that the sticky barrier would block sperm, or perhaps the alkaline nature of aged crocodile dung would create an inhospitable environment. Strangely enough, crocodile dung is slightly alkaline, similar to modern spermicides, so it might have actually had some effectiveness, though undoubtedly it was messy and must have smelled awful. It's hard to imagine a less romantic addition to one's intimate life. But in a time with limited methods for birth control, this was an innovative, if cringe-worthy approach. Couples in ancient Egypt were thus sometimes literally putting crocodile poop to use in the bedroom in the service of family planning, all in the name of hygiene and health, presumably. Let's not forget that even a civilization as splendid as Egypt had to deal with vermin and pests constantly. Houses, even grand palaces, were open to mice, rats, insects, and the like. Food storage areas had to be guarded from rats. Sleeping areas might be treated with incense smoke at night to ward off mosquitoes. Malaria and other diseases were a threat. Wealthy Egyptians slept under linen bednets or mosquito nets when they could, to avoid being bitten in the night, an early version of the bed canopy for pest control. Lice we already covered, shaving and wigs, but fleas were also rampant, especially with all the cats and dogs running around. Egyptians loved their pets and even worshipped cats. They would have burned herbs or resins to fumigate rooms from fleas. Some accounts suggest washing with the urine of certain animals as a folk remedy for flea bites, though how widespread that was, we can't be sure. To maintain body odor control, Egyptians used scented oils and even early forms of deodorant. A recipe for an Egyptian deodorant might include incense, cinnamon, and citrus oils blended into a salve that could be rubbed in the underarms. They also wore perfumes daily. Even the poorest laborer might try to scrub off in the Nile, after a sweaty day building pyramids, and use a bit of whatever aromatic thing he could afford, perhaps just crushed mint leaves to cover any lingering smell. Bad breath was another issue. With all those dental problems from gritty bread, Egyptians often suffered from rotting teeth and gum infections. They created breath mints of a sort by mixing frankincense, myrrh, and cinnamon, and forming pellets that could be chewed or sucked. This would somewhat mask the odor of dental decay. So if you met an Egyptian noble up close, you might smell a cloud of sweet perfume, and perhaps cinnamon on their breath, all to hide the less pleasant natural odors underneath. As you can see, ancient Egyptian hygiene was a mix of advanced habits and gross methods. They bathed often and valued cleanliness, yet they also weren't afraid to use excrement and other cringe-inducing substances in their routines if they believed it helped. It's an interesting contradiction, a culture that idolized purity and beauty, yet had an everyday life filled with smells and sights we'd find hard to tolerate today. As you picture life along the Nile, the golden sunlight, the palm trees, and the people in linen robes going about their day, you can also imagine the less idyllic details, the refuse tossed in the river, the buzz of flies around the market, the pungent mixture of incense and sweat at a busy festival. It's a world distant from our own, yet completely human and relatable in its struggle to stay clean and healthy. Now, with the Egyptian chapter gently drifting behind us, we'll slowly float across the Mediterranean to another part of the ancient world. Take a deep breath, preferably of clean modern air, as we leave behind the fragrant oils and not so fragrant crocodile dung of Egypt. We are heading to a place known for its philosophers, togas, and impressive public works, a civilization that had its own approach to hygiene, both innovative and at times, rather unsanitary. Yes, next we visit ancient Greece and Rome, where communal baths and communal toilets were a normal part of life. Make yourself comfortable as we continue. Ancient Greece and Rome, communal cleanliness and dirty secrets. In the classical world of Greece and Rome, people prided themselves on being more civilized than the barbarians around them. Part of that pride was in personal cleanliness, but ironically, by modern standards, their hygiene practices could still be pretty gross. Let's first wander through a day in ancient Greece, then into the grandeur and grime of ancient Rome. Ancient Greece, especially in cities like Athens and Sparta, had a culture that valued athleticism and grooming. The Greeks didn't have soap initially. Like many early peoples, they cleaned themselves by anointing the body with olive oil, and then scraping it off with a tool called a strigil. Imagine finishing a training session in the wrestling yard of Athens. You're sweaty and covered in dust. A slave attendant hands you a flask of oil, you rub it generously on your skin, and then you take a curved metal scraper and run it along your arms, legs, and torso. The mixture of oil, sweat, and dirt comes off as a sort of grimy sludge. This was how athletes cleaned up after exercise. It also acted as a kind of exfoliation. Many Greek gymnasiums, the public exercise grounds, would have communal troughs or basins for washing and strigiling. The oil did help loosen dirt and the strigil took a lot off. But one can imagine that the tool might not be cleaned between people, so it's possible you were scraping off not only your own sweat, but traces of the previous guys as well. Nevertheless, the Greeks considered the process invigorating and healthy. They would sometimes finish by rinsing with water, or taking a dip in a bathhouse, if one was available. Bathhouses did exist in Greece, though they became more elaborate under Roman influence later on. Early on, a Greek bath might just be a series of basins or a pool of water, often in a gymnasium or a sanctuary. In Sparta, the famously tough Spartans had cold water baths and were said to avoid luxuries like warm water. They thought keeping it Spartan, so to speak, made them stronger. Most Greeks, however, enjoyed a nice warm bath when they could get it. By the Hellenistic period, larger public baths with hot water began appearing in Greek cities, somewhat akin to what the Romans would later build everywhere. One area where Greek hygiene might make you squirm is toilet practices. The Greeks did not have the sophisticated sewer systems of later Rome. In a typical Greek house, especially earlier on, there was no dedicated bathroom. People used chamber pots, basically clay bowls, to relieve themselves, and then emptied those pots outside, in a drain or street. There were public latrines in some cities, but not as ubiquitous as in Roman times. And what did they use for wiping, you might wonder, since toilet paper was not a thing yet? Well, the Greeks are known to have used stones or broken pieces of ceramic potsherds. These wiping stones were called pessoi. Archaeologists have even found smooth rounded ceramic pieces in Greek contexts that appear to be used for this purpose. An ancient Greek writer once remarked that 3 stones are enough to wipe, suggesting a sort of folk guideline for how many pessoi one might need after a typical visit to the loo. It's a bit startling to imagine scraping oneself clean with a stone, but if it's well chosen smooth, not jagged, it likely did the job. Some of these pottery sherds had writing on them, and here's a funny twist. We have evidence that Greeks would take broken bits of pottery and inscribe the names of people they disliked on them, then use them as toilet wipes. In essence, they were symbolically and literally soiling the name of an enemy. In Athens, for example, pieces of pottery used for votes to ostracize unpopular politicians, ostraca, have been found later repurposed as pessoi. So a shard might bear the name of a politician such as Aristides, and then would be put to a very undignified use in the public latrine. It gives new meaning to the term getting your name dragged through the mud. Humor aside, one can appreciate the Greek thrift. Why not reuse broken pottery as a disposable hygiene product? Better than just littering the street with it. Though, as you can imagine, these pessoi were not exactly soft or gentle. Repeated wiping with ceramic could cause irritation. Archaeologists suspect some Greeks suffered from hemorrhoids or sores, partly due to such methods. Despite the lack of toilet luxury, Greeks did try to keep clean in other ways. They washed their clothes, often by trampling them in tubs with water and lye, or simply rinsing in streams. They had public officials in Athens, whose job was to keep the city relatively clean, by enforcing that waste be dumped outside city walls or in designated areas. Still, Greek cities could get filthy. Streets were narrow and often doubled as sewers. Animal dung from horses and donkeys littered the roads. Garbage, pottery shards, food scraps, human waste might accumulate until washed away by rain or cleaned by slaves, or the poor looking for scraps. Part of the reason plague and disease could spread in places like Athens was the lack of proper sanitation. There are accounts of big stinks in Greek cities, and attempts to use perfumes or incense to ward off miasma, bad air. The Greeks, like everyone else then, didn't know about germs, but they did notice bad smells often accompanied illness, so they assumed the smells caused the illness. They weren't completely wrong. The smell came from rotting matter that could indeed harbor disease. But lacking the means to truly sanitize their environment, they coped by burning aromatic plants and keeping personal perfumes on hand to sniff when near something rank. From Greece we now move to the Roman world, which inherited many Greek ideas about cleanliness and took them to a new level, both impressive and at times revolting. The Romans are famous for their public baths and sophisticated aqueducts. Indeed, a hallmark of Roman civilization was the abundance of water in their cities. Fountains, bathhouses, and toilets connected to flowing water. This sounds wonderful, and compared to many other places in the ancient world, it was. However, even the innovative Romans had to struggle with the realities of filth and germs, and some of their sanitary arrangements would make a modern person's skin crawl. Let's start with the Roman baths, one of the social hubs of any Roman town. A Roman bathhouse, or thermos, for large imperial ones, balnea for smaller local ones, was a big complex that had pools of different temperatures. A hot bath caldarium, a warm bath tepidarium, and a cold bath frigidarium, plus steam rooms and exercise yards. Men, and in many places women, either at separate times or at separate facilities, would go nearly daily to bathe, relax and socialize. In the baths, you would strip naked, maybe do some exercise, or get a massage, then sweat in a steam room, plunge in hot water, scrape your body with a strigil, the same tool the Greeks used, and rinse off in cooler water. It was like a combination of a spa and a health club. This was certainly more hygienic than not bathing at all. People did come out cleaner than they went in,
The presence of warm water, however, meant that bacteria had a field day in these facilities. The water in each pool was not drained and refilled for each bather. It was typically changed maybe once a day at best, or some baths only refreshed the water periodically. With hundreds of people per day using a single public bath, you can imagine the soup of sweat, oils, dirt, and who knows what that accumulated. Contemporary writers occasionally complained about the bath water being dirty or smelly. In one satire, a Roman poet joked that the water in a cheap bathhouse was so grimy you shouldn't ask what's floating in it. Lacking chlorine or modern filtration, the Romans tried to mitigate this by having the water flow continuously in one end and out the other. Some large baths had a constant inflow of fresh water from aqueducts, but in practice, many smaller baths may have been cleaned infrequently, and so you'd soak in communal tubs that others had been in all day. It was like an enormous shared bathtub. Additionally, Romans didn't use soap much like the Greeks, they used oil and scraping. So when they sat in the hot water, they sweated out and sloughed off all their dirt and oils into the bath. They would then scrape off their skin with strigils on the bathhouse floor. All that gunk would just accumulate. Some say attendants would sweep up the sludge of oil and hair that collected. Amusingly, and a bit disgustingly, there are stories, or at least later legends, that Roman women collected the sweat of gladiators to use as a beauty product. Gladiators were like sports superstars, and it was believed that their perspiration, mixed with dust called gladiator oil perhaps, had aphrodisiac or cosmetic properties. Wealthy women might even buy scrapings from a famous athlete's skin and use it as a facial cream. It's hard to verify how common this was, but it was a rumor enough to be joked about in Roman literature. Whether or not women really did that, it indicates that Romans were quite accustomed to the idea of sweat and body oils being everywhere in their hygiene routine. So next time you're in a modern spa, and you see a bit of someone else's hair in the hot tub and feel grossed out, remember that Romans probably experienced far more foreign matter in their public baths on a daily basis. And yet they loved going there. It was a highlight of the day. Now on to something the Romans are less eager to advertise in marble inscriptions: the public toilets, latrines. The Romans, with typical organizational flair, built multi-seat public latrines in cities, often adjacent to bathhouses or marketplaces. Archaeologists have found many of these, essentially a long bench of stone or wood with holes at set intervals, under which ran a channel of water to carry waste away. Usually, there was a small gutter of running water at the feet of the users as well. These latrines could host dozens of people sitting side by side, without any dividers or privacy. Yes, using the toilet in Rome could be a very communal experience. You might sit next to a stranger, or a friend, and carry on a conversation, while both doing your business. It sounds awkward, but in that culture it was normal. They treated it as a part of life. Some people even made jokes or recited poetry in the latrine. The question arises, how did they wipe without toilet paper? Enter one of the most infamous and cringe-inducing objects from Roman daily life: the sponge on a stick, known in Latin as the tersorium. This device was a wooden stick with a sea sponge attached at one end. The sponge would be soaked in water, often in that little gutter at your feet, which had water flowing through it, and used to cleanse oneself after defecation. After wiping, you would rinse the sponge in the water. Sometimes they added a bit of vinegar or salt to the water to help clean it, and then leave it by, or in the water channel for the next person. Yes, you heard that right. The sponges were often shared. Perhaps some folks had their personal sponge and carried it in a little box to the latrine, but evidence suggests that in public facilities, there was a common sponge stick for everyone, or multiple sponges in a pot of vinegar water to grab. The idea of reusing someone else's toilet sponge is revolting to us, and indeed by modern hygiene standards, it was a nightmare. Imagine a busy public toilet where dozens of people per hour are wiping with the same few sponges. You can guess that disease spread easily that way. Intestinal parasites like worms were almost universal in the Roman population. Partly because of practices like this, if one person with parasites used the sponge, the next person could unwittingly get the eggs on them as well. Roman medical texts from the era mention all sorts of intestinal worms afflicting people, which is not surprising. Of course, the Romans didn't know about microbes or parasitic eggs, so they didn't realize the sponge sharing was a problem. They might have just seen the running water and vinegar rinse as sufficient cleaning. We, on the other hand, might shudder at the thought. Let's picture a typical scene. You're a Roman of modest means in the city of Rome. You feel nature's call while out working or shopping. You head to the public latrine on the corner. It's basically a big room with fine stone seats lining 3 walls, each seat an oval hole. The room is open air, or maybe roofed but with open doorways, not much privacy. You lift your toga or tunic, and sit on one of the cool marble holes. On either side of you, other men, or if it's a mixed or women's latrine, women are doing the same. Conversation might strike up, perhaps about the weather, or gossip about the arena fights next week. Underneath, a small stream of water continuously flows, carrying waste out to the sewer. When you're done, you take the communal sponge stick from the little trough in front of you, dip it in the clean running water at your feet, maybe swish it in the sour wine or salt water provided, and then give yourself a wipe. You rinse the sponge off in the water channel, and courteous citizen that you are, leave it in a spot for the next visitor to use. Maybe you dry your hands by wiping them on your tunic. Romans didn't universally use soap for hand washing, so some would just rinse in water, others might not even bother. Then you continue on your way. That was a normal Roman bathroom stop. It solved the basic problem. It got waste out of the house and into a drain. But in doing so, it created a whole experience that by modern standards is shockingly lacking in privacy, or true sanitation, or true sanitation, or true sanitation, or true sanitation.
The Romans did have sewers under their cities. The Cloaca Maxima in Rome is a famous great sewer that still exists. These sewers drained runoff water and some waste from latrines into nearby rivers. They helped keep the city from drowning in filth, somewhat. But many poorer areas weren't connected to the sewer, and people still dumped chamber pots out of windows or in the streets at night, just like later Europeans would in the Middle Ages. In fact, one reason Romans built public latrines was to cut down on people fouling the streets. City laws would fine those who tossed waste out of doors or who relieved themselves wherever they pleased. The latrines were an attempt at civil order and cleanliness. They did help, but they also became known as unpleasant places. Writers mention the foul smell and the darkness. Some latrines were dark, dank rooms, perfect breeding ground for rats and insects. People were actually afraid at times to sit on the toilets because rats or snakes from the sewers below might pop up through the hole. There are anecdotes of individuals being bitten on the rear by creatures lurking in the drains. Also, the gases methane from decomposing waste could build up. There are accounts hinting that sometimes the methane ignited and caused a little explosion or fire burst in latrines. Imagine quietly minding your business and suddenly a flame shoots up from beneath you. That would certainly wake you up more effectively than coffee. Because of these risks, some wealthy Romans avoided public toilets entirely. They would use chamber pots at home and have slaves empty them rather than venture into the communal latrine with the common folk and the critters. Public latrines were often used by the lower classes, while the upper class might have private latrines in their houses connected to a cesspit or even to the sewer line in some well-plumbed homes. In Pompeii, for example, many fine houses had a private toilet in the kitchen area, basically a seat over a clay pot or sewer drop. Not very separate from where food was prepared, which might make us cringe, but that was common, to have the toilet in a corner of the kitchen. Perhaps because it was easier to dump the chamber pot into the kitchen waste area. Again, the concept of cross-contamination and germs was unknown, so they didn't see a problem with proximity of waste and cooking, beyond the obvious smell issues. They would sprinkle strong-smelling herbs or incense to mask odors. We should mention urine as well, since the Romans were very pragmatic about using every resource, even pee. Human urine was actually collected and put to use industrially in Rome. Fullers' workshops, places that washed and processed cloth like a dry cleaner of antiquity, used urine as a source of ammonia to clean and whiten garments, especially wool togas. In fact, there were jars set out on streets for folks to urinate in, and the contents would be gathered and sold to the fullers. Emperor Vespasian even imposed a tax on urine collection, essentially monetizing people's pee. The urine was mixed with water in large vats, and cloth was soaked and stomped in it to remove grease and stains. The ammonia in stale urine is a decent cleaning agent. One imagines Roman laundries didn't smell great. Think of the acrid stench of ammonia and old pee permeating the air. There's a famous story when Vespasian's son Titus complained about the disgusting nature of profiting off urine. Vespasian held up a coin and told him money does not stink. In Latin, pecunia non olet. That phrase has endured to mean that the value of money isn't tainted by its origins, though in this case, the origin was literally quite smelly. Romans also found other uses for urine. It was an ingredient in some chemical processes for tanning leather, and believe it or not, it was used as a mouthwash by some. Yes, some Romans would rinse their mouths with aged urine, which again is essentially an ammonia solution because it could whiten teeth. We have references that even mention importing Portuguese urine because it was supposedly strong. Apparently the urine from the Iberian Peninsula was prized for its potency in teeth cleaning. While this sounds horrid, the ammonia in urine does indeed cut through plaque and can bleach teeth whiter. But it surely left the breath less than fresh. Poets like Catullus joked about people who had dazzling smiles because of lots of urine. The practice of using urine for dental cleaning persisted in places even into the medieval period. There are references to it in 16th century texts too. So the next time you gargle mouthwash, be thankful for modern minty formulas, and that you're not swishing a mug of sour human urine around to get those pearly whites. Romans also had to deal with vermin in daily life. Like Egyptians and Greeks, they were plagued by lice and fleas. We have found combs in Roman archaeological sites with very fine teeth, clearly used to pick nits and lice out of hair. Roman children and adults frequently had lice. Delousing someone might have been a common motherly chore or a task for slaves picking lice from the master's hair. It's quite likely that as people lounged in the public baths, they also took the opportunity to inspect each other or themselves for lice and pick them off. Somewhat like apes grooming each other, except in a marble bath hall. There's a charmingly gross scene you can imagine: two Romans sitting on the edge of a hot bath, casually plucking lice from their scalps and flicking them away or squishing them, all while discussing the day's politics. One Roman writer, Seneca, even commented on how one should endure things like fleas or lice calmly, as a fact of life. They also mentioned bedbugs in some texts. Those were a nuisance then as now. Without effective pesticides, people tried folk remedies, scattering ashes or certain herbs in bedding, or hanging a bull's hoof amulet on the bed that was supposed to ward off bedbugs somehow. Likely none of this was very effective, and people simply had to tolerate some biting at night. Despite all these unsavory details, the Romans really did achieve a level of public hygiene that was not seen again in Europe until modern times. They had public bathhouses on almost every corner in big cities. Imagine being able to bathe affordably every day even if you were poor. Quite nice. They had sewer systems to channel away waste even if maintenance was imperfect. They had street cleaning crews and regulations about keeping the city cleanish. They believed in fresh air and exercise as keys to health. These are things we value too. But concurrently, their lack of understanding of microbiology meant they could not see the invisible problems. The spread of disease through communal sponges and bathwater, the lead pipes. Yes, many water pipes were lead, potentially causing lead poisoning, and so forth. They just did the best they could with what they knew. and culturally they were less shy about bodily functions in public. A Roman might think us strange for wanting complete privacy in a bathroom. To them it was a social space in some contexts. As you settle deeper under your covers, feeling grateful for your modern plumbing, you can rest assured that we've learned a lot from those messy times. But our journey isn't over. Next we will drift further east to explore how ancient Chinese civilization dealt with cleanliness and the lack thereof, in ways sometimes very different, sometimes surprisingly similar to the West. So take a slow breath and let's quietly travel along the Silk Road to Old China. Ancient China, ingenious innovations and odd remedies. Now we find ourselves in ancient China, a vast civilization with a long history and a mix of advanced ideas and peculiar practices regarding hygiene. Chinese culture, being very old and diverse, offers a rich tapestry of habits, some that feel familiar and sensible, and others that are downright bizarre to modern eyes. We will gently explore how people in historical China kept clean or tried to, from grand imperial palaces to humble farm dwellings. First, it's worth noting that cleanliness was indeed appreciated in traditional Chinese philosophy. Concepts of balance and purity, like the idea of inner and outer harmony in Taoism, or the emphasis on ritual cleanliness in Confucianism, meant that being clean could be seen as a virtue. Many Chinese bathed regularly when they had the means. In fact, in some periods, Chinese cities had public bathhouses not unlike the Roman ones, though often smaller. Hot springs were also used for bathing when available. There is a record that by the Tang dynasty 7th to 9th centuries AD, even toilet paper had been invented and was being used in China, an innovation that wouldn't reach the West for many more centuries. But I'm getting ahead of the timeline. Let's start earlier. Personal grooming in ancient China included practices like daily face washing and foot washing. There was a custom of offering guests water to wash their feet in some eras, since walking on dusty roads left them dirty. Bathing might not have been daily for common folks, especially in colder northern China, but likely weekly or so, and more often in warm climates. Wealthy families had wooden tubs for bathing, and servants would heat water. Herbal bath mixtures were popular. For example, leaves of mugwort or flower petals might be added to bath water for fragrance and believed health benefits. People also commonly used powdered rice bran or ground bean powders to scrub their skin as a cleansing agent, a bit like soap. By around the Qin and Han dynasties circa 3rd century BC, 3rd century AD, evidence shows the Chinese had developed a form of soap made from plants, like soap nut or bean-based concoctions. They also pioneered a remarkable tool we all use today, the toothbrush. The earliest bristle toothbrush was found in China, probably around the Tang dynasty 7th century AD, made with hog hair bristles fixed into a bamboo or bone handle. Before that, like many cultures, they used chewing sticks from aromatic trees like willow or miswak to clean teeth and freshen breath. But it was the Chinese who likely first said, "Let's attach pig hairs to a stick and make a brush to scrub our teeth." So if you brushed your teeth today, you owe some thanks to ancient Chinese ingenuity, even though early brushes were boar bristles, hard and not so gentle on gums. The Chinese also came up with toilet paper, as noted. As early as the Sui dynasty 6th century, there are references to paper used for hygienic purposes. By the Tang dynasty, a scholar official wrote that he dare not use paper with written text like writings of sages for the toilet, implying plain paper was indeed used to wipe. And by the 14th century, Yuan Ming period, large-scale production of coarse paper specifically for toilet use is recorded, especially for the emperor's palace where huge quantities were made. So while a medieval European was using rags, hay, or just fingers and water, a person in China could have thin paper to finish the job. That's a rather advanced comfort. Not everyone could afford paper all the time, but the concept existed. Common people in rural areas might still use natural materials, bamboo leaves for instance, or water washing, but paper was an option in the cities if you had some money. In terms of sanitation infrastructure, Early Chinese cities did have drainage systems. For example, the ancient city of Mohenjo-Daro in the Indus Valley, not in China, but around the same era 2000 BC, had great drains, and in China around the Zhou dynasty, palaces had drains for wastewater. However, many ordinary dwellings in ancient China did not have piped sewage. People used outhouses or cesspits. One distinctive practice in China, particularly among farming communities, was the clever reuse of human waste as fertilizer, a practice that, while ecologically sound, was pretty gross in execution. Night soil, as human excrement was politely called, was a valuable commodity for fertilizing fields. In cities there were professional collectors, who would each night or early morning go house to house emptying chamber pots and cesspits, gathering the waste into barrels. These night soil collectors then carted the precious dung off to sell to farmers outside the city, who would compost it and spread it on their crops. It was messy, smelly work, but it actually contributed to agricultural fertility and was a form of recycling. There's an old Chinese saying, "Treasure night soil, as if it were gold," highlighting how important fertilizer was to crop yields. One downside, handling human waste, especially without gloves or modern sanitation, exposed people to diseases like cholera or parasites, again the parasite problem. But they often composted the waste properly, letting it age, which can kill some pathogens before applying to fields. This practice was common in China for thousands of years right up until 20th century in some areas. It meant that a lot of human waste was kept out of rivers good, but it also meant people literally valued poop enough to collect it carefully. Interesting dynamic. Now consider the toilets themselves in old China. In poorer rural areas, a common design was a simple pit latrine, or an outhouse, sometimes cleverly combined with pig pens. Yes, the Chinese farmers in some regions had what's called a pig toilet. This was an outhouse built over the pigsty, with a chute or opening that dropped human waste directly into the pig's feeding trough or pen. The pig would then consume the waste along with any other food scraps. Pigs are omnivorous, and will eat excrement, not pleasant, but they will. This practice basically turned the pig into a garbage disposal, eating the farm's waste and converting it to pig flesh, which humans later ate. In terms of resource use, it's very frugal, no waste wasted. But from a hygiene viewpoint, it's pretty unsavory. The pigs could get parasites from human waste or vice versa, a cycle of disease. Still, this method persisted because it was convenient. It cleaned the outhouse without the farmer having to shovel, and it fed the pig cheaply. One can imagine the smell around such an arrangement was horrendous, a mixture of pigsty and latrine. Yet to the people living there, it was normal farm life. They likely didn't let pigs roam free after that. Usually the pig would be butchered eventually. There's a dark humor in thinking that a pig was fed so literally on human refuse, and then the humans would eat the pig, a kind of full circle of grossness. But hunger and pragmatism often dictated these choices. In the cities, public toilets did exist. A Chinese author in the Eastern Han period, around the 1st century AD, described multi-seat latrines in the imperial palace and city, some with buckets that could be cleaned, others connecting to sewers. By the time of the Tang and Song dynasties, circa 7th-13th centuries, larger cities had public latrines, and they were often cleaned by those night soil men. Some places even had an early flush mechanism. An archaeological find of a 2000-plus-year-old toilet in China showed a seat with a drain and water reservoir, possibly a manually flushed toilet, likely for a noble's tomb or house. That's remarkably advanced, essentially a flush toilet, long before such things were common anywhere. But it was not the norm for most people at all, who still used simple pit toilets or pots. Now, aside from the practical bathroom stuff, ancient China had a fair share of strange and gross hygiene-related practices, mostly in the realm of folk medicine or habit. One notorious recommendation from an ancient Chinese medical text was that everyone should wash their armpits with urine at least once a year. The idea was that stale urine's ammonia would cleanse and deodorize the underarm. Indeed, ammonia can neutralize some odors, but you'd probably end up smelling like, well, urine. Nevertheless, it was suggested by some physician ages ago, and likely some folks tried it. Think of it as an annual detox for your armpits, in a weird way. Urine was actually used quite a lot in Chinese remedies, for skin conditions, acne, fungus for ear infections. There are records of dripping warm urine into ears for earache, and even in tonics to drink. Yep, some recommended morning urine as a healthy drink. A practice that has popped up in various cultures, not just China. The Chinese also refined a substance called autumn mineral, chushi, which was essentially human urine that had been processed and crystallized. They used it as a component in medicines, believing it had yang energy and could cure various ailments. And how about lice? In China as elsewhere, lice love to live in people's hair and clothes. Many poor people in ancient China were so used to lice that they would idly pick them out and, in a rather revolting habit, eat them. Yes, historical anecdotes mention people cracking lice between their teeth or eating them after picking them off their bodies. It sounds horrifying, but it might have been almost reflexive. When you catch a louse crawling on you, what do? Today we'd flick it or crush it in tissue. Some of them would just pop it in their mouth and kill it. Perhaps there was a tiny bit of protein there too, for those perpetually hungry. It was common enough that apparently there were even folk remedies for someone who had eaten too many lice and gotten sick from it. That's how routine lice eating was in certain impoverished communities. A medical text advised that if someone had abdominal pain from eating lots of lice, yuck, you should give them a drink of boiled water with ashes from a comb to help them pass the bugs. It's almost surreal, imagining a mother scolding her child, "Stop eating your lice, you'll get a stomachache." But such was life for the poorest, who were riddled with vermin. Meanwhile, wealthier Chinese households kept neat. They washed clothes. There was a whole profession of washermen women who would pound clothes in rivers using lye made from plant ash, and they styled hair with fragrant oils or pastes. Still, even emperors were not immune to lice and fleas. Lavish silk robes could hide a thriving community of lice in their folds. Some emperors changed clothes multiple times a day, partly to always wear fresh deloused garments, sending the used ones to be boiled and cleaned. In one case, an ancient text praises a certain diligent lady of the palace for inspecting the emperor's garments for insect pests daily. Body odor was another concern. Genetics actually play a role. Interestingly, a large proportion of East Asians have a gene variant that leads to less body odor, drier earwax type, associated with fewer odor-producing sweat glands. This might mean fewer people had strong underarm odor compared to, say, Europeans. It's conjecture based on modern genetics, but perhaps many Chinese historically didn't need heavy deodorants. Nonetheless, smell was noted in literature as something to manage. Wealthy Chinese carried scented sachets on their person, little pouches filled with aromatic herbs like clove, sandalwood, or camphor, to ward off unpleasant odors, and as a fashion accessory. They hung these from belts or tucked them in robes. When meeting the emperor, courtiers were even required to suck on cloves beforehand, so that their breath would be pleasant in his presence. Halitosis was frowned upon at court. Imagine being an official and frantically chewing cloves before an imperial audience. This indicates an awareness of personal odor and efforts to mitigate it. However, not everyone bathed as often as we might expect. Some groups in China, such as certain Taoist practitioners, believed in minimal bathing. They thought that too much washing could deplete the body's vital energy, or even wash away protective oils that keep illness out. This mirrors a bit the European medieval notion that bathing could let disease in.
In northern China's cold winters, people also avoided bathing for practical reasons. In frigid weather, with no indoor heating, stripping down for a bath could be dangerous to health. So during winter, many might not bathe for months, simply changing underclothes and sponge bathing face and hands. There is a Tang dynasty story about a scholar who proudly said he hadn't taken a proper bath in years, and it was considered a bit eccentric. On the flip side, in nearby Korea, influenced by Chinese culture, but with their own twist, historical records show people bathed often, even daily in some cases, and they were perplexed that some Chinese didn't bathe as much. This regional variety is interesting. Even within China, customs varied. Southern regions with warm weather saw more frequent washing, whereas in the far north, people made do with less. The Chinese are also known for their traditional medicine, which has some gross elements relevant to hygiene. One is the use of dried feces called nightshade or specific names in remedies. For example, dried fermented child feces, known as golden juice, was used in small doses to treat digestive disorders. It sounds counterintuitive. Treat stomach trouble by giving a bit of poop. But the logic might resemble modern fecal transplant ideas. Replenish gut flora maybe. Hard to say if it helped, but it was part of the pharmacopoeia. Another was urine therapy, using human urine, or even infant urine in medicinal concoctions, believing it had detoxifying properties. Indeed, urea from urine can have some effects on skin and such, but the thought of intentionally consuming these substances for health, well, one has to be pretty committed to the cause. A notable cultural practice, though not exactly hygiene, is foot binding in later imperial China, from around the Song dynasty onward. Young girls' feet were tightly bound to deform them into the tiny lotus foot. This caused lifelong difficulty walking, and relevant to our theme, terrible hygiene issues for the feet. The bound foot would often develop infections, as toenails grew inward, and flesh was cramped. It was said the feet had to be regularly unbound and cleaned of decaying skin and foul odor, only to be rebound again. Men found the tiny feet alluring as a beauty standard, but ironically they never saw them bare. The feet were always wrapped in cloth and hidden in embroidered shoes, partly because unwrapped they were disfigured and often had a smell of frankly rot. This is a gruesome example of how a beauty practice created a hygiene nightmare. Girls' feet would bleed and suppurate, yet they'd keep them tightly under wraps. Wives would have their poor husbands or maids wash their bound feet carefully in special herbal soaks to mitigate the odor and infection. It's a disturbing chapter that persisted for centuries. Though foot binding is not general hygiene, it certainly was an area where cleanliness was hard to maintain due to the deliberate deformity. To sum up the ancient Chinese hygiene experience, it was a blend of surprisingly modern ideas: toothbrushes, toilet paper, regular bathing for some, street cleaning services, etc., and deeply traditional, or strange ones: urine cleansing, eating lice, pig toilets, and medicinal use of excreta. China's long continuity meant knowledge accumulated. By the medieval period, Chinese cities had some of the best public health measures in the world at the time. Travelers from Europe in the 13th century, like Marco Polo, noted that cities like Kanbalik, Beijing, were relatively clean, with officials who swept the streets, and that people bathed more often than Europeans. However, we must also note that plagues and diseases still struck China too, often facilitated by crowded cities and poor quarters, where waste management was suboptimal. As we drift out of the Chinese realm, perhaps slightly amazed at human adaptability, we realize that across different cultures, people tried all sorts of things, sensible and senseless, to deal with the universal challenges of dirt, sweat, pests, and waste. Now, we will quietly move on to another era, known for its lack of cleanliness: medieval Europe. Prepare for a gentle stroll through muddy streets and dank castles, where hygiene took a notable downturn after the fall of Rome. Don't worry, we'll keep the tone soothing as we describe the filth, just enough detail to paint the picture, but delivered like a bedtime story of a world lit by smoky tallow candles and scented by, well, less than pleasant aromas. Onwards we go, slowly and sleepily, to the Middle Ages, medieval Europe, filth, foul odors, and attempts at cleanliness. Ah, medieval Europe, often romanticized with knights and ladies, castles and troubadours. But if we could actually visit a European town in, say, the 12th or 14th century, our first reaction might be to pinch our noses. Personal and public hygiene in the Middle Ages was, by modern standards, dreadfully poor. Not everywhere, and not all the time. There were exceptions and improvements here and there, but generally, the era from roughly the 5th to 15th centuries in Europe is notorious for grime and stink. This isn't to say people wanted to be dirty. Often they simply lacked the infrastructure or knowledge to be cleaner. Let's amble through a day in medieval Europe, noticing the little details of how people dealt with dirt and bodily needs, all the while keeping a calm, matter-of-fact tone. Bathing was not entirely unknown in medieval Europe, contrary to popular belief. Early in the Middle Ages, many people still used public bathhouses, a holdover from Roman times, and also influenced by the Islamic world's hammams, bathhouses, through cultural contact. In cities like Paris or London, around the 13th century, there were indeed bathhouses. They called them stews in England. Oddly enough. However, over time, a combination of factors made frequent bathing less common. The church sometimes cautioned against public baths, associating them with sinful behavior, since bathhouses often became mixed gender or fronts for brothels. There was also a growing idea that bathing too often could weaken the body or open pores to disease, especially after the Black Death, the plague in the 14th century. Some Europeans thought that water could actually carry contagion into the body. As a result, by late medieval and Renaissance times, many people in Europe bathed rarely, certainly far less than the Romans, or many ancient cultures did. For many medieval folks, a bath meant just wiping down with a damp cloth occasionally, or washing only certain parts of the body. There was the concept of a dry wash, basically rubbing oneself with clean linens, undergarments, or powders to absorb oils and sweat, without using water. Full immersion baths were a luxury. Heating enough water in a big tub, and doing so in a drafty house, was a chore, and sometimes risky, fire hazard, etc. So perhaps a wealthy lord might have a bathtub brought to his chambers once in a while, and servants pour hot water in. Maybe he'd do this monthly, or a few times a year. Queen Elizabeth I of England, 16th century, a bit after medieval period, famously said she took a bath once a month, whether I needed or not, and that was considered, often by her standards. There's a legendary claim, likely exaggerated, that Queen Isabella of Castile, late 15th century Spain, boasted of only bathing twice in her whole life, once at birth, and once before her wedding. Whether true or not, it reflects a certain pride some took in not bathing, as if it were a sign of piety or toughness. Cleanliness became oddly suspect. People thought if you scrubbed off too much, you might also scrub off divine protection or modesty. Additionally, regular baths were associated with the pagan Romans, or the luxury-loving Moors Muslims in Spain, so some devout Christians shunned them to distinguish themselves.
What did they do instead? Changing clothes became the surrogate for bathing. If you could afford it, you'd change your linen undergarments frequently. Linen was prized because it could absorb sweat and oils from the skin. A clean linen shirt or shift worn under your wool or silk outer garments would keep you feeling somewhat fresh. The idea was the dirt and sweat stick to the linen. which you then wash or have your servants wash, maybe weekly. Medieval advice books suggested sleeping in a clean nightshirt and airing out your daytime linen to let the sun freshen it. So cleanliness was somewhat maintained by laundering clothes rather than scrubbing the body. However, this only goes so far. If you never wash your body, eventually the buildup is significant. Apparently, people's body odor was just accepted. Everyone smelled a bit or a lot ripe, so it wasn't remarked on much unless someone was truly overpowering. They did use perfumes and scents. A lady might carry a bouquet of herbs or flowers, a posy to sniff when encountering a foul smell. This is often cited as a plague measure. The pocketful of posies in the nursery rhyme was about keeping herbs to ward off miasma, but it was generally useful whenever walking through a stinking street or dealing with a smelly companion. And oh, the streets did stink. Cities in medieval Europe were filthy environments. Without modern sewers, waste, both human and animal, accumulated. People commonly emptied chamber pots right into the street. In many towns, if you lived on an upper floor, you'd open your window or shout a warning. In French they said gardes l'eau, meaning watch out for the water, which in English became gardes l'eau, and fling the contents of your night's chamber pot down to the gutter below. Passers-by would step aside if they heard your call, hopefully. Streets often had central ditches or gutters for waste to somewhat flow through when it rained, but in dry weather it just sat there. Now add the presence of many animals. Horses were the main transport, and they dropped manure everywhere. Livestock like pigs or chickens often roamed in early medieval towns as well. Rotting food garbage was thrown out too for scavenging dogs or pigs to consume. So a medieval street assaulted not just your nose but also your eyes and feet. One had to wade through muck at times. Some cities did hire rakers or sweepers to clear big messes, and larger cities had ordinances against littering the streets with offal, but enforcement was spotty. In 14th century London, they complained that some streets were imbued with the excrements of animals and men to the point of being impassable. The River Thames in London and the Seine in Paris effectively served as open sewers as well. Latrines or drains from houses often led straight into the river. It's no wonder that drinking water had to be drawn from safer sources like wells or springs outside the city because the river water was often contaminated. Many drank ale or wine instead of water, partly because fermentation killed germs and water was suspect. They didn't know germs, but they knew bad water could make you ill. Toilets in castles or manor houses typically were simple privy rooms called garde-robes, basically a seat over a shaft in the wall that dropped down, sometimes directly into the moat or a pit below. Castle moats doubling as toilets. Yes, some castle moats essentially became sewage lagoons. Not all moats were that way, but some certainly were fouled by the waste dropping out of castle latrines. In simpler homes, people used chamber pots or just went in the stables or yards. There was also the medieval occupation of the gong farmer in England or similar roles elsewhere. These were the poor souls who would be hired to clean out latrine pits and cesspools. They usually worked at night for the understandable reason of the smell and the desire for discretion. They would shovel out the accumulated waste night soil from cesspits and cart it outside the town to dump, sometimes selling it to farmers as fertilizer, much like in China. This job was dangerous, not only extremely unsanitary but also at risk of asphyxiation from fumes in deep cesspits. Some accounts suggest gong farmers would carry a torch into the pit not just for light but to burn off methane pockets to avoid explosions or suffocation. Imagine lighting small fires in a pit of poop to clear the gas. Brave. They were well paid, ironically, because few would do it. A gong farmer in Tudor England slightly after medieval could earn more than a common laborer due to the nasty nature of the work. But they had to live with the stigma and stench. Some regulations required them to live apart from others and only work at night so as not to offend people's noses. What about pests? Medieval Europe was crawling with them. Fleas and rats famously contributed to the spread of the Black Death in the 1340s. Homes were not sanitary. Rush's straw often lined the floors of even wealthy houses, and these rushes weren't changed often. They threw new rushes on top of old, but underneath layers might fester rotting food bits, vomit, urine from pets or drunk people, and general filth, becoming a paradise for fleas and lice. Wealthy folks sometimes added herbs or flowers to their floor rushes to sweeten the smell, but unless they changed them out completely and scrubbed the floors, which by accounts was rare, maybe seasonally at best, it remained a problem. Beds were infested with bedbugs or lice. People tried remedies like sprinkling foul-smelling chemicals, for example brimstone or vinegar, in the bed, but success was limited. Lice on the body were so common that nitpicking, literally picking nits' lice eggs, became a social activity. In some medieval communities, particularly among women, delousing each other's hair was a communal, even relaxing time. They would sit in the sun and go through a child's or friend's hair, cracking lice between fingernails. Medieval combs often had very fine teeth to help remove lice. Yet, given the infrequency of full bathing and the difficulty of keeping clothes louse-free without hot washing, people lived with these parasites continuously. Itching was probably just a background sensation of life. Some folks shaved their hair short to reduce lice in the Middle Ages. Men often did keep hair fairly short, and women covered theirs with veils or hats, possibly also to hide less than clean locks. Dental hygiene in medieval Europe was minimal. They did have some tooth cleaning practices, rubbing teeth with a cloth, using toothpicks, often quills or wooden sticks after meals, or rinsing the mouth with wine or vinegar. But there was no toothpaste as we know it. Some recipes for tooth powder existed: charcoal, salt, herbs, but many couldn't afford such luxuries. Tooth decay and loss were common. By mid-age, many people would have lost several teeth or suffered abscesses. Foul breath was likely common, to the point where it had to be really extreme for anyone to remark on it. Those who could might chew fragrant herbs like parsley or mint to freshen breath, especially before social occasions. But the average peasant had a mouth that a modern dentist would find horrifying. Ironically, sugar was not widespread in Europe until late medieval period. So in earlier medieval times, cavities might not have been as rampant as later when sugar entered diets. Still, coarse bread and lack of brushing wore down teeth and led to infections. The only dental cure was extraction, done by the local barber or a traveling tooth puller, without anesthesia, except maybe getting the patient drunk first. It was a tough existence tooth-wise. Despite all this, people did value being clean when they could be. There are medieval manuscripts with instructions on washing hands before and after meals, which was done with basins and ewers of water. Good manners dictated clean hands at table because people ate with fingers largely. If you were a guest, a servant might bring a bowl and jug to pour warm water over your hands and give you a towel. This was a nice ritual that at least kept hands somewhat clean and mitigated grease. In the morning, many would rinse face and hands as well. So it's not that they never touched water, just not full baths often. There's evidence that ordinary folks did swim or bathe in rivers in the summer for refreshment and cleaning. In warmer parts of Europe, occasional river baths probably helped. But for much of the year, especially in cold climates, they just layered clothing and hoped for the best until spring. Clothing hygiene. They did wash clothes, at least underclothes and linens. Washerwomen often did laundry in rivers or large tubs, using lye soap made from animal fat and ash. Soap making was known, a soft soap that was rather harsh on fabrics and skin but could do the job. The smell of lye soap wasn't great either, but it cut grease. Outer garments like heavy woolens or fancy embroidered things might seldom be washed. Instead, they'd be aired out or brushed. Over time, those could get pretty funky, imbued with smoke from hearths and sweat. But the fashion of the time was to wear layers, so hopefully the underlayer caught most of the sweat and could be washed. One more particularly gross aspect of medieval life: diseases and how they managed them. There was essentially no concept of sterilization. If someone had a wound, they might wash it with water or wine, which could help a bit, but often they'd apply balms that included things like animal dung or human saliva as part of folk recipes. Similar to the Egyptians, there were medieval cures using excrement. For example, a popular remedy for throat inflammation was to cook a swallow the bird and mix it with human feces and apply as a poultice. I know, the logic is lost on us, but such recipes existed. Another one, fresh pig dung, was used to treat nosebleeds by some healers, the idea being that its cold, moist properties would stanch the blood. These are certainly gross realities of medieval medicine that few talk about. Plagues like the Black Death led people to desperate cures, such as sitting in sewers or smoke houses to drive away the disease. They thought if the plague was caused by bad air, maybe other bad air like latrine fumes or smoke would counteract it. None of it helped, of course. After the initial plague waves, city officials did start to implement more cleaning measures, like removing waste and improving water supply, but progress was slow. Actually, by late Middle Ages, some towns like in the Low Countries, Holland etc., were relatively cleaner. They had street gutters and required residents to keep the area in front of their house swept. But Southern Europe, with legacy of Roman baths, ironically had less bathing by medieval Christian times, except in Islamic Spain or Sicily, where bath culture remained under Muslim influence. One interesting contrast: while Christians in Europe shunned bathing, the Muslim world in the Middle Ages cherished it. Cities like Baghdad, Cordoba, Istanbul later had numerous bathhouses, and people bathed often as part of religious ritual ablutions for prayer and custom. A crusader from Europe going to the Holy Land in the 12th century would have been amazed to see locals bathing daily and using soap which was better quality, often olive oil soap. In fact, it's often said that crusaders brought back soap to Europe. Certainly by the 13th century, soap-making guilds popped up in Europe, maybe learning from Islamic soap recipes. But adoption was slow among general populace. So medieval Europe is a picture of a world where people lived in their dirt much more intimately than we do. They were familiar with the sights and smells of unwashed bodies, the constant presence of waste and animals, and they developed a certain stoicism about it. They tried to mitigate what they could with pleasant fragrances, ceremonies like hand-washing, and occasional cleaning efforts. But by and large, if we time-traveled there, we'd likely be overwhelmed by the pungency. That being said, they themselves would probably not notice it strongly. The human nose can get used to an environment, and that was simply the normal baseline. Perhaps a medieval person would find our modern world strangely odorless or too sterile, with all the chemical smells instead. It's an intriguing thought. As you lie there and maybe feel a bit icky thinking of such filth, take comfort. You are in a time where you can bathe regularly, use soap and flush away waste with the push of a lever. The medieval person could only dream of such ease if they could even imagine it. We have one more segment of our journey to briefly touch on other cultures around the world and their unique hygiene practices, some surprisingly ahead of their time, some charmingly odd, and some downright nasty. Then we'll conclude our sleepy history tour. If you're still awake, stay with me for a little longer. If you're drifting off, that's perfectly fine. Let the mumbling about filth and cleanliness become a hazy background murmur in your dreams. Other cultures and practices, a patchwork of clean and not so clean. Before we conclude, let's gently survey a few other corners of the world and eras to appreciate the diversity of hygiene practices. It's a reminder that humans everywhere faced the same challenges and came up with creative, if sometimes gross, solutions. We won't go too deep, just a light, calming skim through different scenes, like flipping through an old picture book of world history, quietly and slowly. The Indus Valley Civilization, c. 2500 BC in what is now Pakistan, India, deserves a nod for being remarkably sanitary for its time. Cities like Mohenjo-Daro and Harappa had planned sewage systems.
Houses were often equipped with drains that channeled wastewater out to covered sewers along the streets, an incredible innovation in the Bronze Age. They even had early toilets, essentially brick platforms with a hole and a clay pipe or chute leading to a sewer or soak pit. It seems likely that some homes had something like sit-down toilets or squat toilets that were regularly cleaned by pouring water. These people also made pottery bathtubs. Archaeologists found tub-like vessels in homes that could have been used for bathing. One of the grand structures in Mohenjo-Daro is the Great Bath, a large public bathing pool, indicating the cultural importance of cleanliness or ritual bathing. And interestingly, they produced a lot of pottery, some of which might have been used to store water or even as chamber pots. Compared to their contemporaries elsewhere, the Indus people really stand out for their hygienic urban planning. Their cities might have been relatively pleasant and clean, to a point. Of course, they still lacked flush toilets or modern waste treatment, so it wasn't that clean. But imagining their brick-lined drains covered with slabs, taking waste away, it's quite advanced. Sadly, after that civilization declined, the Indian subcontinent saw less urban hygiene until modern times. Although culturally, ritual bathing in rivers like the Ganges became and remains a significant practice for spiritual purification in Hindu tradition. Even if the river water wasn't exactly sanitary, the act of daily or frequent bathing was a positive for hygiene. Many Indians historically would bathe at least by pouring water over themselves from a well or river each morning, a stark contrast to medieval Europe's rare baths. Moving to the Islamic Middle East in the medieval period, say 7th to 15th centuries, as touched on earlier, they had a strong emphasis on cleanliness. The Quran and Hadiths include guidance on personal hygiene, such as washing hands, face and feet before prayers, the ritual ablution called wudu, and full-body baths after certain circumstances. As a result, bathhouses hams were widespread in Muslim cities. These were often elegant establishments with hot steam rooms and cool pools, not unlike Roman baths. People would visit them weekly or more to get scrubbed clean. One traveler's account from the 12th century describes Damascus having numerous baths, and that even villagers would come to town to bathe regularly. They also used soap, which they refined from earlier formulas. Hard bar soap, as opposed to soft liquid soap, was being made in the Middle East by the 8th century, using ingredients like olive oil, lime, and alkali. Basically the ancestor of today's Castile soap. A crusader returning to Europe might have brought some soap, or the knowledge of soap making back. There's a famous tale that a sultan sent a gift of soap to a crusader king. Whether true or not, it illustrates that soap was considered a valuable item. Additionally, Islamic hygienic law encouraged things like trimming the mustache, keeping teeth clean with a miswak twig, and shaving pubic and armpit hair periodically for cleanliness. This meant many medieval Muslim individuals were probably more groomed and smelled better than their Christian counterparts at the time. Ironically, Europeans often commented disparagingly on the perfumed Saracens, not realizing perhaps that the perfume was covering a well-washed body, whereas the Europeans' perfume was battling a much stronger odor. In the Mongol Empire 13th century, interestingly, it's said the Mongols generally avoided washing in rivers because of a spiritual superstition about polluting water sources, water spirits, etc. They would clean themselves by rubbing with animal fat, or taking sweat baths in tents, a sort of makeshift sauna, using steam. They also thought that dirtying oneself a bit on campaign could be a way to ward off evil. This might be more myth than fact, but it is true that nomadic people in the steppes had limited water for frequent bathing, so they found alternatives, like smoke baths, standing over aromatic smoke to absorb its smell, or simply developing a tolerance to being unwashed for longer periods. Yet they weren't completely oblivious to hygiene. They had strict rules about where to defecate away from camp, for instance, and they wore layers of silk underclothes, which they could shake out to remove lice. Silk is slick, and lice eggs don't cling to it as easily. A gruesome detail. One observer claimed that some Mongols never washed their clothes, instead wearing them until they literally fell apart. That could be an exaggeration, but it paints a picture of how foreign a concept regular washing was in some nomadic cultures compared to urban ones. In sub-Saharan Africa, practices varied widely among different societies. Many African communities prized washing in natural waters. For example, in West Africa, people would bathe in rivers regularly. It's hot, and a river bath is cooling and cleansing. They also used local soaps, made from shea butter or palm oil, and ash. African black soap has ancient roots. In some cultures, like ancient Ethiopia, there was a form of steam bath, using the smoke and steam of certain herbs for health and cleansing. Meanwhile, some groups like the San Bushmen, in arid southern Africa, had to conserve water and instead used ash or clay to cleanse and deodorize the skin, similar to how some desert peoples use sand or ash to scrub without water. Many African huts were kept quite clean by regularly replastering the floors with fresh clay or dung mixture. Dung, when dried, doesn't smell and actually repels insects. This brings up the interesting case of dung-plastered houses in parts of Africa and elsewhere. Mixing cow dung with mud to plaster walls and floors was common. Fresh dung smells, but once dried, it leaves a smooth sealed surface that insects don't like, and that can be swept easily. So what sounds gross, smearing dung on your house, actually resulted in a cleaner, healthier home interior, long term. It's another example of how gross materials had beneficial uses. On the American continents, indigenous peoples had diverse practices. Many Native American tribes valued sweat baths or sweat lodges. They would sit in enclosed huts with heated stones and pour water to create steam, essentially a sauna, and then often plunge into a cold stream afterward. This served ritual purification purposes, but also must have been great for hygiene, opening pores and flushing out dirt. Not to mention, it's relaxing. This was documented among tribes from Canada down to Central America in different forms. Mesoamerican civilizations, like the Aztecs and Maya, had a tradition of temazcals, sweat baths, as well, often adjacent to their homes or temples. The Aztecs reportedly bathed frequently. The Spanish conquistadors, who arrived in Mexico, were stunned to see that the Aztec Emperor Montezuma reportedly took baths, often some say daily, in the river or in a pool of his palace, and that common people also bathed regularly and kept clean. The Aztecs even had soaps made from plant roots, soapwort, and used fragrant flowers, like vanilla, orchid, and copal, for perfuming their bodies. One chronicler noted the Aztecs love cleanliness and bathe often and have no body odor, whereas the Spaniards, who arrived, had a strong smell that the natives found unpleasant. So here's a dramatic cultural contrast. Usually Europeans thought others smelled bad. In this case, the indigenous people thought the unwashed Europeans smelled horrible, and they likely did, after a long sea voyage, and generally lax bathing habits. The Spanish did adopt some bathing after this, but in general they still held on to the idea that too much bathing was not good. Over time in the colonial period, ironically, hygiene standards in the Americas dropped under European influence, but many indigenous communities kept their sweat bath traditions alive. In East Asia beyond China, Japan had a very early bathing culture, influenced by both Shinto, purification under waterfalls, etc., and later Buddhism. Communal baths, called Furo hot tubs, and Sento, public bath houses, have existed for a long time. By the Edo period, 1600s to 1800s, ordinary Japanese townsfolk would bathe daily, or nearly so, which was far more frequent than Europeans of that era. But even in earlier times, say around the 7th–8th century, Japanese people would use the many hot springs or heat water in bathtubs. Cleanliness was a valued part of etiquette. This is why Japan historically didn't suffer quite the same level of plague or disease outbreaks as Europe. Better hygiene played a part, though they had their issues too, of course. Southeast Asian cultures, in tropical climates, also bathed often. Easy when it's warm and water is abundant. In the ancient Angkor Kingdom, Cambodia, they built large reservoirs and water tanks, which might have been used in part for bathing the populace, aside from irrigation. Across these examples, we see a general pattern. In warmer climates, water bathing tended to be more frequent because it's comfortable to do so, and water wasn't frozen, whereas in colder climates, people devised ways to avoid water, like steam, or just skipping bathing and relying on clothing. Also, cultural and religious values greatly influenced how far people went to stay clean. Some considered cleanliness next to godliness, others considered it vain or even dangerous. It's fascinating and a bit entertaining to see how many gross solutions our ancestors came up with. Using pee, poop, mud, fat, ashes, smoke, herbs, or just plain scrubbing and scraping, they tried it all. And bit by bit, knowledge accumulated globally on what worked and what didn't. We eventually figured out how disease spreads and the importance of sanitation, leading to our modern cleanliness standards. Now, our journey through the ages of filth and cleanliness is nearly at its end. You've listened to descriptions of some quite unsavory things in a very calm manner, and perhaps this monotony has made your eyelids heavy. Before we finish, let's wrap up gently with a short outro, summarizing and sending you off to dreamland, with maybe a newfound appreciation for your toothbrush and shower. Conclusion, outro. We've now wandered through the murky byways of history's hygiene practices, from Egyptian priests shaving their heads to avoid lice, to Roman citizens sharing a sponge on a stick, to medieval peasants tossing sewage into the street, to far-flung peoples scrubbing with sand or soaking in hot springs. It's been a long, slow journey, quietly examining how human beings dealt with the universal realities of dirt, sweat, and waste. Some of the stories were a bit gross, okay, maybe more than a bit, but I hope the gentle telling made them oddly comfortable to listen to. Perhaps even a little smile or chuckle escaped you at some of the absurdities before you relaxed again. Think of how far we've come. Tonight, you can sleep soundly on clean sheets, knowing that no one will dump a chamber pot out the window above you, and that you won't wake up covered in flea bites, with a rat running across the floor. We have soaps that smell like lavender or lemon, instead of pastes made of ashes and animal fat. We have toothpaste that doesn't thankfully involve burnt eggshells or urine. We have bathrooms that whisk away our waste with a simple flush, out of sight and out of mind, leaving our homes smelling fresh. In a way, learning about the gross trials of ancient hygiene can make us very grateful for modern sanitation. It's one of humanity's greatest achievements, even if it's not something we usually brag about. As you drift off to sleep, you might imagine for a moment the sounds of an ancient night, the faint chatter of Romans in a bathhouse, or the chorus of crickets as a medieval town finally grows quiet and dark, save for the rustle of straw and maybe a distant gardyloo called out into the alley. These are the sounds of ordinary life long ago, but you are here, now, in a clean and safe place, warm and comfortable. History is for the moment just a story, a boring story, perhaps, but one that makes the present feel even cozier. Thank you for joining me on this peculiar tour of the past. In a world lit only by fire, our ancestors did what they could to stay clean, or at least keep the stink at bay, and I've enjoyed recounting their efforts in this low, slow voice as you relax. Feel free to let go of any lingering thoughts of ancient toilets or strange soaps. you can leave those in the past, where they belong. Now, it's time to close your eyes, take a deep breath of fresh air, and let sleep wash over you, as gently as a warm bath. Good night, and sleep well. May your dreams be clean and pleasant, and may you awaken refreshed, appreciating the modern luxuries of soap, water, and a new day, water, and a new day, water, and a new day, water, and a new day.